after Japan's defeat in the First World War and its subsequent rise as an imperial power in the 1930s, its army expanded across East and Southeast Asia. In 1932, after violent clashes in Shanghai, Japanese military planners created what they called comfort stations. These were organized brothels for troops, presented officially as a way to control venereal disease and maintain discipline. But in reality, they concealed a system of forced sexual labor. Recruiters, some military, some civilian brokers, spread through occupied territories: Korea, China, the Philippines, Taiwan, Indonesia, Burma. They promised women jobs as nurses or factory helpers, only for them to be sent to frontline encampments under armed guard. Many were teenagers. The women came from diverse backgrounds, but the largest number were Korean, at the time subject to the Japanese Empire. Testimonies decades later described trains crowded with girls who had never left their villages, believing they were headed for decent work. Once inside military zones, the truth became clear. Small huts or barracks divided into cubicles, each with a mat, a wash basin, and a soldier's queue outside the door. Regulations dictated hours, payment that the women rarely received, and medical inspections. Commanders insisted that this system prevented rape and preserved order, but records show widespread coercion and violence. As the Pacific War deepened, Japan's logistical networks grew chaotic. The Army's morale faltered, and comfort stations multiplied across islands from New Guinea to Okinawa. The women endured bombings, disease, and starvation alongside soldiers. When Japan began to lose the war in 1944, many stations were abandoned. Some women were killed in retreat, others left behind. Some escaped when Allied troops advanced. In places like the Philippines, U.S. forces found brothels recently vacated by the Japanese military, stark evidence of a system that until then had been almost invisible to outsiders. By August 1945, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the Soviet invasion of Manchuria forced Emperor Hirohito's surrender. Japan lay in ruins. Cities bombed flat, infrastructure broken, and nearly 7 million soldiers and civilians returning from former colonies and battlefields. The old imperial ideology collapsed overnight. Into this vacuum stepped the Allied occupation, led by the United States under General Douglas MacArthur. For ordinary Japanese, the first days of surrender brought confusion, hunger, and fear of what the conquerors might do. Rumors swept through towns that American soldiers would take revenge, that women would be violated as punishment for Japan's aggression. Newspapers, newly freed from censorship, reflected the anxiety. The phrase, "Onaga no kuni no toko," men from the belly-button country, a slang for Americans, carried both curiosity and dread. In this tense atmosphere, officials within Japan's new provisional bureaucracy and remnants of the police sought a way to shield the general population from what they imagined would be the uncontrollable desires of occupation troops. They believed, mistakenly but sincerely, that sexual access could buy safety. Thus began the Recreation and Amusement Association, RAA, an organization created in the first weeks after surrender. It was August 18, 1945, only 3 days after the Emperor's broadcast, when a group of former Home Ministry officers convened in Tokyo's Shinjuku district. Their memorandum stated the aim clearly: to provide facilities for the relaxation of Allied soldiers, thereby protecting the chastity of the nation. Funding came from the government's labor ministry and police cooperation. The system would be staffed by Japanese women, some recruited from the pre-war licensed prostitution districts, others newly drawn in by poverty. In the shattered economy of post-war Japan, rice was scarce, black market trade rampant, and most men either dead or prisoners abroad. Women became the first to face starvation. Flyers appeared on telephone poles and in newspapers. Special female workers wanted for hospitality to the Allied forces. Many thought it meant cleaning or serving tea at clubs. Some understood more and joined anyway, reasoning that survival, however humiliating, was better than hunger. The earliest RA facilities opened in September 1945 in Yokohama and Tokyo, hastily repaired buildings with tatami rooms, paper walls, and baths. U.S. military police posted guards outside to prevent disorder. To the American command, these were legitimate recreation centers, similar to rest clubs. For Japanese organizers, they were a desperate buffer. If American men could find controlled outlets, perhaps ordinary women in the streets would be spared. At this early stage, the memory of the imperial comfort system was still raw among those who had witnessed it. Some Japanese feminists, such as Ichikawa Fusey and Hiratsuka Reicho, protested that the new plan repeated wartime exploitation under a different flag. But the voices of women's rights advocates were small compared to the overwhelming hunger and chaos. Government officials, seeking to please the occupation authorities, proceeded quickly. When the first contingents of American soldiers landed at Tsuji Air Base and marched into Tokyo in late August, the streets were silent. People bowed low, women wore white headscarves in token of surrender, and the sight of tall, well-fed Americans astonished onlookers. The soldiers, for their part, had been warned by their commanders to maintain strict discipline. "You are ambassadors of democracy," their order said. "No looting, no violence, no fraternization without permission." Within days, interpreters from the RAA approached American officers, offering hospitality centers for enlisted men. Many officers were perplexed. They had not requested such services. Yet, when visiting journalists reported that brothels were operating with the approval of the Japanese government, the arrangement appeared to have tacit sanction. Lines of GIs formed outside the facilities. Tickets were issued, and doctors performed medical checks. Behind the paper walls, Japanese women, some former geisha, others widows, students, or survivors of bombings, met men from a nation they had been told were monsters. What followed was often a strange collision of expectation and reality. The women had imagined cruelty. The soldiers, shaped by propaganda, expected submissive Oriental girls. Instead, confusion, awkward politeness, and sometimes mutual sympathy unfolded. A few soldiers tried to speak Japanese phrases they learned from pocket guides. Konnichiwa, Daijobu ka? Some brought chocolate or kin food. Yet beneath these brief human gestures lay an enormous imbalance of power. The women were not free participants in leisure. They were caught in a structure of national desperation. Each night, hundreds served men they could barely communicate with, then queued for inspections by Japanese doctors under the eyes of American MPs. Disease spread rapidly, and reports reached the U.S. Medical Corps that venereal infection rates were climbing. By late 1945, occupation authorities began to question the morality and health implications of the RAA. American social workers and female officers in the Women's Army Corps protested that the system resembled the very military brothels the Allies had condemned in wartime propaganda. Japanese officials, however, insisted it was voluntary and essential for maintaining order. As the cold autumn of 1945 turned to winter, Tokyo streets filled with demobilized soldiers, widows selling family heirlooms for rice, and children begging near the ruins of train stations. The RA expanded rapidly. Special comfort facilities opened in Osaka, Kyoto, and Fukuoka. The government even set quotas for workers. Thousands of women registered, their identities recorded under euphemisms like special type I employee. Many of these women left personal diaries later discovered by historians. One wrote, "We were told we would protect the nation, but the nation had already disappeared." Another recalled her first encounter with an American private who, to her surprise, bowed clumsily before entering the room. She had braced herself for violence, remembering tales of the Japanese Army's treatment of women in China and Korea. Instead, the soldier simply said, "Hello," handed her a cigarette, and waited for permission to sit. For many of these women, the shock was not kindness alone, but the realization that the victors, the supposed enemies, treated them more gently than their own wartime authorities had. That paradox would haunt Japan's post-war consciousness for decades. The awareness that cruelty had come not from outsiders, but from within. By early 1946, the RA network had spread through Japan's major cities. Tokyo alone had dozens of facilities, some converted from theaters or inns, others purpose-built out of the rubble. Thousands of women were registered as special workers. Government bureaus oversaw supplies and health inspections. The police handled crowd control outside. In official documents, the program was presented as a patriotic service, a line of defense for national honor. At the same time, American occupation policy was shifting. The supreme commander for the Allied powers, SCAP, General MacArthur, was beginning a sweeping democratization of Japan. New constitution, land reform, disbanding of the military, release of political prisoners. Within this agenda, state involvement in prostitution appeared incompatible with democratic ideals. Reports from U.S. military doctors describe high infection rates and poor sanitation in the RAA centers. American women serving with the Red Cross and Women's Army Corps voiced moral objections, calling the system a continuation of slavery under another name. In February 1946, MacArthur's headquarters issued an order that effectively ended official sanction of the RAA. The directive banned all government participation in prostitution and required the closing of comfort facilities for Allied use. Japanese officials complied formally, dissolving the RAA, though many establishments simply reopened as private clubs or pampan districts under local management. The occupation authorities now faced the very problem the Japanese planners had feared: thousands of unemployed women and uncontrolled street prostitution around bases. The women who had worked in the RA were left without protection or income. Some returned to ruined hometowns. Others stayed near the cities, forming informal alliances with soldiers who offered food or shelter. These relationships were complex, part survival, part genuine human contact. The American command referred to them as individual arrangements, a phrase that revealed both bureaucratic detachment and recognition that social boundaries had blurred. Meanwhile, public attitudes in Japan toward these women hardened. Newspapers, now freer but still cautious under occupation censorship, began describing them as pampan girls, symbols of moral decline. In reality, they were casualties of collapse. Former students, nurses, even wives of fallen soldiers. Post-war literature captured their ambiguous position. Writers like Dazai Osamu and Tamura Taijiro portrayed them not as villains, but as mirrors of a nation stripped of illusion. In the broader occupation society, American military discipline generally held. The feared wave of violence did not materialize on the scale imagined in August 1945, though incidents did occur and were prosecuted by U.S. courts-martial. Japanese citizens gradually realized that the conquerors were strict but not vengeful. This realization deepened the paradox that at first startled the women in the RAA. The Americans, despite being victors, often treated them more predictably than their own authorities had during the war. By 1947, Japan's economy began a slow recovery. Inflation stabilized, food supplies improved, and a new constitution guaranteeing equal rights for women came into effect. Yet the personal scars remained invisible. Few of the former RAA workers spoke openly. Many had their past from families. For the government, acknowledging their existence was politically inconvenient. It contradicted the narrative of democratic rebirth. Official records were quietly destroyed or sealed. Among occupation officials, sociologists and public health officers started to study the broader social impact. They documented the emergence of black market entertainment districts, the spread of mixed-race children called Ainoko, and the continuing marginalization of women who had once served in the RAA. Some of these children would later face discrimination in schools and workplaces, reminders of how deeply the occupation years had marked Japan's social fabric. In Washington and Tokyo, historians would later see this brief experiment, the RAA, as a revealing moment when two vastly different cultures met under conditions of defeat and victory. For the Americans, it was an administrative problem. For the Japanese, it was a moral reckoning. The episode forced both sides to confront the legacy of militarized sexuality that had begun long before 1945 and would echo long afterward in debates over the wartime comfort women. By 1948, most of the original RAA sites were gone or converted into dance halls and cafes catering to occupation troops. The women who remained in the trade did so privately, without state supervision. Police occasionally rounded them up, citing new public morals laws, but enforcement was inconsistent. Behind the statistics lay the quiet endurance of individuals who had once been told they were defending the nation's purity and now struggled simply to live anonymously. When the Allied occupation formally ended in 1952, Japan re-entered the international community as a sovereign state. The story of the RA and the women who worked there faded from official memory, overshadowed by economic reconstruction and Cold War politics. Yet among historians and surviving participants, the memory persisted, a reminder that defeat had forced Japan not only to rebuild its cities, but also to question the values that had governed both war and peace. In the first years after the formal dissolution of the RA, Japanese society tried to push the subject out of sight. The occupation reforms brought new rights for women, suffrage, legal equality, access to education, but these advances rarely reached those who had been labeled pampan. The majority hid their pasts. Many had no homes to return to. Others had families who refused them out of shame. A few found work in the growing entertainment industry, serving as bar hostesses or singers in the dance halls that replaced the old, special comfort facilities. American authorities, too, were eager to move on. Official reports described the RA as an unfortunate but temporary necessity. The occupation's priorities had shifted to rebuilding Japan as a Cold War ally. By 1949, the Korean peninsula was in turmoil, and Japan's ports, bases, and factories became vital to U.S. strategy. The narrative of democratization and economic recovery left little room for remembering the compromises of 1945. Yet beneath this amnesia, daily life in the post-war cities revealed continuing hardship. Black market districts, such as Tokyo's Yamaichi and Osaka's Dotonbori, were full of war widows and orphan girls selling small goods by day and companionship by night. Health officials quietly estimated that tens of thousands of women still relied on sex work for survival. The new Democratic government passed the Prostitution Prevention Law in 1956, but its enforcement was uneven, and social prejudice ensured that many remained trapped in poverty. A smaller number of the former RA workers wrote down their experiences, though publication had to wait decades. Their accounts described not only exploitation, but also the bewildering encounters with the first Americans they met. Some remembered acts of kindness, gifts of chocolate, help finding lost relatives, photographs taken together. Others recalled humiliation, disease, and loneliness. What united these memories was a sense of having lived through a collision of worlds, the collapse of an empire and the sudden arrival of an unfamiliar democracy. Among American soldiers, too, impressions of Japan shifted quickly. The fear of hostile civilians faded, replaced by curiosity and sometimes affection. Many GIs frequented the same cafes where ex-RA women worked, and a number of marriages took place despite bureaucratic hurdles. These relationships produced thousands of mixed-heritage children. In the 1950s, the Japanese government, anxious about social order, encouraged adoption abroad or placement in welfare institutions. Only later did scholars connect these children's stories to the early occupation period and the vanished RA. Meanwhile, historians began to uncover the broader system that had preceded it, the wartime comfort stations across Asia. Allied war crime tribunals briefly touched on the issue, but Cold War politics soon muted further investigation. It was not until the 1970s and 1980s, as feminist movements gained strength in Japan and Korea, that survivors started to speak publicly. Their testimonies revealed the continuity between the military comfort system of the empire and the short-lived RA of the occupation. Both had treated women's bodies as instruments of national policy, first for conquest, then for protection. Within Japan, this realization challenged the comfortable image of post-war innocence. Writers and filmmakers began exploring themes of complicity and silence. Works by artists such as Imamura Shoei and novelist Enchi Fumiko depicted women navigating the moral debris of defeat. In these portrayals, the pampan girl became a symbol of survival in a society that preferred forgetting to understanding. By the 1980s, archives released under declassification laws allowed researchers to reconstruct the administrative side of the RA, meeting minutes, health records, and correspondence between Japanese ministries and SCAP officers. They showed how thoroughly the system had been planned and how quickly it had been erased. For younger generations, raised amid prosperity, the idea that their parents' generation had sanctioned such a policy was jarring. Public debate followed, often emotional, about responsibility, memory, and the meaning of democracy born from defeat. Internationally, comparisons with the earlier wartime comfort women system reignited controversy. Korean and Filipino activists demanded official apology for coercion under Japanese rule. Japanese scholars noted that the post-surrender RA had reused much of the same bureaucratic logic, though without direct military force. The juxtaposition forced a reckoning. Japan's liberation from militarism had not immediately ended the attitudes that commodified women in the name of national interest. By the end of the 20th century, a small number of surviving RA workers began to give oral history interviews. Their tone was often measured rather than accusatory. They spoke of hunger, confusion, and the desire to protect others by absorbing danger themselves. One woman said, "We thought if we opened the door first, maybe they would not break into our neighbors' homes." Her words capture the tragic reasoning of 1945, a belief that sacrifice could redeem a broken nation. Their testimonies drew sympathy from some, skepticism from others, but they reinserted the women's own voices into a story long told only through official documents. Academic conferences and museum exhibits in the 1990s and 2000s began to treat the RA not as an isolated anomaly, but as part of Japan's broader process of post-war reconstruction and moral re-education. By the 1990s, Japan was one of the world's leading economies, a democracy that had transformed its wartime ruin into prosperity. Yet prosperity could not erase the unresolved past. As archives opened and survivors aged, historians and activists revisited both the wartime comfort stations and the occupation-era RA. What emerged was a layered picture of how societies remember, or choose not to remember, trauma. Television documentaries and university studies began to interview women who had lived through the 1945 to 46 period. Some spoke anonymously, others on record. Their recollections were neither heroic nor self-pitying. They described exhaustion, fear, and a persistent disbelief that their government had once declared their suffering a patriotic duty. Journalists tracked down former officials who admitted that the RA had been created under panic, driven by the conviction that controlled hospitality could avert chaos. One elderly bureaucrat told a reporter, "We thought we were protecting the people, but we only passed the pain to the weakest." The Japanese public reaction was divided. Younger generations, educated under pacifist ideals, saw these stories as evidence of how militarism had deformed moral judgment. Conservatives argued that reopening the subject tarnished the image of national recovery. For many families, silence remained the default. Parents who had lived through the occupation rarely spoke of it to their children. Yet in classrooms and museums, a new kind of history began to take shape, one that acknowledged the contradictions of liberation and defeat. Internationally, pressure for recognition of wartime sexual slavery intensified. In the early 1990s, former Korean and Filipino comfort women filed lawsuits in Japanese courts. Though these cases concerned the pre-1945 system, they inevitably drew attention to the occupation period as well. Scholars emphasize that the RA had not been an isolated event but part of a continuum. The same logic that had justified comfort stations in wartime, control, protection, national interest, had resurfaced in the guise of post-war defense against imagined threats. The Japanese government issued statements of remorse, but stopped short of full legal responsibility, citing the treaties of the 1950s and 1960s that had normalized relations with its neighbors. Domestically, feminist historians and human rights groups pressed for broader acknowledgement. They organized exhibitions showing not only the suffering of foreign victims, but also the plight of Japanese women caught in the RA. Their purpose was not to equate the two experiences, but to demonstrate how deeply a culture of militarized obedience had penetrated civilian life. In the early 2000s, local governments and civic groups began preserving the sites of the former RA facilities. In Yokohama, an old wooden building once used as a special comfort house became a small museum. Visitors found faded photographs, health certificates, and the typewritten orders that had authorized the system. On one wall hung a translation of a letter from an American military doctor urging its closure in 1946. Nearby, the testimony of a former worker was displayed. "We believed we were protecting our sisters. Later I learned that protection built on fear is not protection at all." Academic research also expanded beyond Japan. Korean, Chinese, American, and European scholars collaborated to piece together the global context, how wartime and post-war occupations everywhere tended to reproduce gender hierarchies and exploit women's labor. The RA became a case study in how a defeated nation negotiated surrender through the bodies of its most vulnerable citizens. Public debate grew heated again in the 2010s as nationalist politicians questioned parts of the historical consensus. They argued that post-war prostitution had been voluntary, that records were unreliable, or that such discussions embarrassed Japan abroad. In response, historians published carefully annotated collections of documents from both Japanese ministries and SCAP archives, demonstrating that the initiative had been official policy, not private enterprise. Younger activists used social media to share the stories of the women as part of broader campaigns for gender equality. By the 2020s, the memory of the occupation era had become a touchstone for Japan's ongoing reflection on democracy. School textbooks, once reticent, began including brief but clear descriptions of the RAA and its dissolution. University courses treated it as a lesson in how states manage defeat and moral panic. The surviving women, now in their 90s, were honored in quiet ceremonies rather than public spectacles. Their lives trace the arc of Japan's modern history, from empire to ruin, from silence to testimony. They had been born in an age that taught obedience and lived long enough to see freedom defended in their names. To scholars and citizens alike, their stories illustrated how history's darkest mechanisms, fear, hierarchy, the rationalization of necessity, can persist even under the banner of Reconstruction. Today, historians regard the episode of the Recreation and Amusement Association as a bridge between two eras, the militarized empire that ended in 1945 and the democratic state that emerged afterward. It shows how easily a society, desperate to survive, can repeat patterns of coercion it believes is left behind. And it reminds readers that the measure of democracy is not only in laws or prosperity, but in the willingness to face what was once hidden. In the quiet archives of universities and local museums, the faded files of the RA now rest beside testimonies of the wartime comfort women. Together they tell a continuous story of war, surrender, misunderstanding, and the slow, painful work of moral reconstruction. The women who once stood at the edge of history, dismissed as shameful or forgotten, have become its central witnesses. Through their memories, Japan's passage from empire to democracy can be traced not only in politics or economics, but in the enduring question of how a nation chooses to remember those who bore its burdens when everything else collapsed.